So in this section of our presentation, we'll be talking about how can borrowing against my portfolio, instead of using taxable withdrawals, generate more wealth for both myself and my beneficiaries. Again, this is part 4 of our presentation on how do I increase my risk-adjusted portfolio returns and minimize taxes as I plan for retirement. If you haven't seen the previous sections of this presentation, I'll include links down below. So let's kind of jump right into it. In order to understand why borrowing against your investment portfolio instead of utilizing taxable withdrawals is better, we first need to understand, the step up in basis provision and how we can use this provision to pass wealth on tax-free to the next generation. Now, step up in basis is a provision that's allowed wealthy individuals to pass on wealth tax-free for decades now. So step up in basis is a provision which allows married couples the ability to pass $24 million to beneficiaries tax-free if they pass on these assets to beneficiaries through death. So their beneficiaries inherit these assets upon death of the last married couple or married individual. Again, if you're single, you can still pass on wealth, but not as much. It's about half this, right? Since it's only one person. But this is the benefit of step up in basis. If you're looking to generate generational wealth or pass on as much assets as you can to your kids, you want to use this provision to pass on wealth. So the benefit of utilizing both step up in basis as well as borrowing against your portfolio is that it allows individuals or married couples the ability to invest for the long term and have beneficiaries inherit the majority of the gains tax-free, while also allowing the retirement couple the ability to borrow against it at low rates if they need it. So if the married couple or single individual is in retirement, they need money, they can always borrow against the portfolio. But if you're really looking to generate generational wealth and pass on as much wealth as possible, you want to, again, minimize the tax drag on it. And using step up in basis to pass on millions of dollars tax-free is a great way to do it. So I know this sounds a little bit complicated, so I'm going to kind of use an example just to kind of highlight how it works and why you want to pass on assets to the next generation tax-free through step up in basis, as opposed to, selling assets, and what the difference is, right? Again, we're going to look at, a couple, one individual wants to pass on assets after death. They want to use the step up in basis provision, and another individual wants to invest for a certain period and then sell assets and give it to their kids. And we're going to see the vast difference in those two approaches. So here's our hypothetical example. John and Sally Smith are both 50-year-old high net worth individuals in California who combined make $450,000 a year and are at a 33.1% marginal tax bracket. Both John and Sally take $25,000 of each of their after-tax salary, and they invest it in a growth equity index fund through a Vanguard taxable brokerage account. And they're using Vanguard because, again, it's a low cost, like we talked about, low expense ratios. The fund does not pay any dividends, right? So it's a growth fund, no dividends. You're only getting the capital appreciation, and it grows at 8% a year. Both John and Sally invest their $25,000 for 30 years. So they put it in, on day one when they're 50, and they invest for 30 years. At the end of 30 years, John sells his investments and gives the net proceeds to his son, right? So he put the $25,000 in, he invests it for 30 years, and then at the end of 30 years, he sells it and gives the net proceeds to his son. Sally, on the other hand, wants to invest for the long term and use the step up in basis provision. So at the end of 30 years, Sally dies and her son inherits the net proceeds. So the question I want to ask here is, well, which parent loved their son more? And we're going to show you, which parent in this quick mathematical example. So John, again, he invests the $25,000. It grows at 8% a year, and it's compounding for 30 years. It grows to $251,566. Again, this is subject to a 33.1% tax rate. So after the taxes, John receives $176,573, and then gives that amount to his son. He just gifts it. So that's what his son receives. However, Sally, because she passed on the assets through death and utilized the step up in base provision, again, that 25K still grows to $251,000. But however, due to step up in basis, the son inherits the assets. So there's no paying taxes and then gifting. So the son inherits the whole $251,000 tax-free. So again, the answer to which parent loved their son more is Sally, because Sally smartly realized that she could pass on more wealth simply by investing for the long term and not selling those assets, right? And paying the large tax drag. Step up in basis allows individuals' ability to bypass taxes when passing on wealth to the next generation. So let's talk about some highlights here about why should you borrow against your security portfolio instead of selling securities and paying taxes on the gains. Obviously, we saw the answer in the previous slide, but a couple of quick pointers or highlights here. Borrowing against your security portfolio allows for the ability to pass on wealth tax-free, again, through step up in basis, while also providing liquidity. You can borrow against it, the same way you can borrow against your house, or we'll talk about that in a second here. In fact, borrowing against your security portfolio is a lot cheaper, and the rates are a lot less than current refinancing rates. Again, you can borrow up to 70% of the collateral value of your portfolio. So again, it's not as high as borrowing against your house, because there you can do about 80%, but it's pretty close. And similar to a mortgage, right? The interest is deductible. If you pay the interest on that at the end of the year, within the year, that interest is actually deductible. But probably the most important ability is that the fact that when you sell securities, you pay taxes, just like we saw in the previous slide, and that reduces wealth. And so just quickly, when we're talking about rates here, we talked about rates being significantly less than refinancing rates. I just wanted to quickly show you some rates. Again, this is as of May 28th, but margin rates are about 1.5 to 2%. Again, you can borrow about 70% of your portfolio through margin. Whereas if you look at 15-year refinance or 30-year finance rates, yeah, you can borrow a lot, or not a lot more, but 80%, so 10% more. But look at how much higher the rates are, right, relative to borrowing against your portfolio. So you're borrowing against your portfolio, you're not paying taxes. And, as you can imagine, if you're doing that, and your portfolio is making more than what you're borrowing at, you can see how this benefits individuals in accumulating wealth. So a couple of quick tips when you're borrowing against stocks. You don't want to borrow the maximum amount. Obviously, we talked about how you can borrow up to 70%, but you don't want to borrow the maximum amount, because what happens is if there's a drop in the value of your stock portfolio, let's say, the stock portfolio drops by, you borrowed the maximum amount, your stock portfolio drops by 20%, then what happens is the lender can sell some of your stocks to make sure that that cushion is still 70%. And so you don't want that to happen. You don't want the stock market to have a short-term drop, and then essentially the lender to sell your stock portfolio when it's at when it's low, because essentially they're selling it low, right? So what you want to do is you want to leave a cushion, right? So you don't want to borrow the maximum 70%. Again, 30% to 50% is a decent range, and you probably don't even need to borrow that much. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But you do want to leave a cushion. Don't borrow the maximum amount. And again, you want to borrow, when you're borrowing, you're not borrowing against individual stocks. You're borrowing against an index fund, right, which is a lot more stable and less volatile than individual stocks. You don't want your entire investment portfolio to be one stock position, right? Otherwise, that's super risky. Again, as the equity market goes up, like as the value of your portfolio goes up, that means you have more cushion, so that you can consider borrowing more if you want to. Paying off the margin interest every year allows you to get the tax deduction for doing so. So here's just some quick tips. So now in the next few slides, I really want to show you the vast advantage that comes with using 100% equity portfolio with portfolio borrowing in retirement, or margin borrowing, as opposed to the traditional 60-40 retirement portfolio that comes with taxable withdrawals. So it's going to be, like we talked about, it's going to be lower earning, right? Because you have a heavier bond allocation, and the taxes are going to create a drag, right? Especially since you have the rebalancing here. So let's kind of just do a high level comparison between the two strategies. Again, here's the first strategy, 100% equity portfolio with portfolio borrowing versus a 60-40 portfolio with taxable yearly withdrawals. So we're going to compare two things, the long-term gross returns and the estimated taxes. So here, of course, the long-term expected gross returns are going to be higher, right? Because it's invested in pure equities, 100% equities. And there's also a low cost of borrowing, right? So as we'll show, we saw on the previous slide. So the long-term gross returns are going to be a lot higher here, and we'll dive into that on the next slide. Versus the 60-40 portfolio, which is only in 60% stocks and then 40% bonds, which is dragging the gross returns down. On top of that, the taxes, the percent of the earnings that are lost to taxes are going to be really low here. Because it's a 100% equity portfolio. And again, as we talked about, stocks have the benefit of tax deferral. You get the step up in basis, right? Where you can pay almost zero taxes if you don't sell any of the gains or sell any of your positions. Versus the 60-40 portfolio, again, in order to get your distributions, you're doing taxable withdrawals. And if you're a higher earner, you're paying 30% to 40% of that in taxes, if not more. So just to summarize, a 100% equity portfolio has higher long-term gross returns and lower taxation, significantly lower taxation. So the after-tax returns are significantly better. So you're building a lot more wealth by using a 100% equity portfolio with portfolio borrowing, both for you as well as for your beneficiaries. And we'll dive into that in an example in the next few slides. So again, let's look at a case example here, just to show you the real benefit of this 100% equity portfolio with portfolio borrowing versus a traditional 60-40 retirement portfolio with taxable withdrawals. So again, our case couple here is John and Sally Smith. They're both 55-year-olds in California looking to retire early. Each have $2 million for retirement. John wants to do the 100% equity portfolio using margin borrowing or portfolio borrowing. Again, we're going to assume it's 2% cost of that borrowing for retirement spending. So John is not going to have any taxable distributions. He's just going to borrow against his portfolio at a 2%, a low rate. However, Sally, wants to do something else. She wants to go with the traditional 60-40 retirement portfolio and use taxable withdrawals, right? That's what, everybody else is doing. That's what financial advisors, are recommending she does, and she wants to go ahead and do that. For our assumptions here, we're going to say that the equity portfolio is at 8% and the bond portfolio is at 3.5%. So we can immediately see, right, if I have 100% of 8%, that portfolio is going to be earning a lot more than if I do a blend of 60% of 8% and 40% of 3.5, right? So again, the withdrawal rate is going to be 4% each year, right? So both have $2 million. So both are going to take out $80,000 with increases for inflation. We're using a 2% assumption here. The difference, obviously, is John is borrowing it, so there's no taxable withdrawals, versus Sally is, again, taking taxable withdrawals. So again, the assumptions here is that the long-term capital gains tax rate is 20%. The ordinary income tax rate is 26%. So we're going to use the assumption that both live 30 years and then die. So the question we're going to be asking is, again, who loves their son more? Because their son will inherit what's left over. So we're going to see that in the next slide here. So at the end of 30 years, John leaves $21.7 million to his son, right? Because that $2 million was growing at 8% compounded, and he was borrowing at 2%. However, Sally, on the other hand, only leaves $2.4 million to their son, rather. So John's after-tax return is 9.68%. So you might be saying, wait a minute, Rajiv, like it was a 100% equity portfolio, but that was only earning 8%. So how is his after-tax return 9.68%? And the reason is that he was borrowing against it at 2%, right? So by borrowing against it, it allowed him to utilize the benefit of leverage, right? So and tax deferral. We talked about the benefit of tax deferral. Of not having, having that 8% be compounded. Sally, on the other hand, her after-tax return is significantly less, right? Because again, first of all, her gross returns were less because she was in a 60-40 portfolio. So her after-tax return is only 5.55%. So in this scenario, John clearly loves his son significantly more than Sally because John was prudent in his financial planning and how to use financial tools to advance his objectives, right? Of making sure that he has enough withdrawals for retirement, as well as maximizing the amount he's able to give to his son at death, again through the step up in basis provision, right? So John, again, doesn't it has the benefit of just not paying much in taxes, as well as using the step up in basis provision to pass on a majority of the wealth to his son. So again, utilizing financial planning tools to advance an objective here. So the 100% equity portfolio has higher long-term gross returns and lower taxation, while you're borrowing retirement spending instead of using taxable withdrawals. So the after-tax returns are significantly higher. Again, you're using the benefit of leverage as well as compound returns. Well, you might be saying, well, Rajiv, what if I do need to take taxable withdrawals, or I want to make taxable withdrawals? What is the best way to do that with my stock investment portfolio? So again, a cool thing about long-term capital gains is that if that you can pay 0% in taxes in retirement. You just have to plan it properly. So long-term capital gains tax rate is 0% up to $109,000 worth of income, and that's again in today's time. This will probably change in the future, but the key thing is, again, you can't have any other income besides what's coming at what you're withdrawing from your portfolio. But if you have 109,000 of long-term capital gains and that's your only income, you can take that essentially out tax-free. So the way to think about that is you have to think about that in the context of your tax bracket. So we're going to look at a high income earner. This is the marginal ordinary income tax rate by age with optimal planning. Okay, when this individual is working, let's say they're working until 60, they're in the highest tax bracket. Let's say it's 50%. But immediately after they stop working, their tax bracket, again, especially if they're in an all equity portfolio that doesn't really pay dividends, it drops to close to 0%, right? They're not making any income, and they're not taking any Social Security, right? So there's an opportunity here before they start taking Social Security or have RMDs from any IRAs that their tax bracket is going to be really, really, really low. So the goal here in your planning is, if you do want to pay to do taxable withdrawals, is immediately after you retire, is use this 0% tax rate up to $109,000 each year, again, before your Social Security kicks in and before your required minimum distributions kick in. So just to summarize here, proper planning can allow investors to both retire early and extend their retirement savings, right? Because again, by limiting your taxes on your gains, that's more that you have that you can withdraw in retirement and extend in case you live longer than expected, right? So that kind of summarizes our presentation here about how to maximize risk-adjusted portfolio returns and minimize taxes. Again, we do help RIAs and high net worth individuals with their planning. So if you thought this was informative and want more information, or want to connect or see how we might be able to work together, feel free to reach out to us. Again, at our phone number or email is the best way to reach me. Again, my name is Rajiv Rebello, and you can also visit our website at colvaservices.com.